The scream came from the top of the stairs, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet of the old stone house like a blade through silk. Elena Hartley froze at the bottom step, her hand still on the banister, her heart slamming against her ribs. She had been in this house for exactly 4 minutes. A small girl, no older than 3, stood at the top of the staircase, her face red and wet with tears, clutching a torn stuffed rabbit. Behind her, a boy of about 14 leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, watching the scene with a bored, hardened expression that no boy his age should have worn. A woman in a gray uniform tried to reach for the toddler, but the child only screamed louder and backed away toward the railing. Elena did not think. She dropped her bag on the marble floor and climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her flat shoes slapping against the stone. She knelt in front of the little girl, not touching her, just lowering herself so their eyes were level. "Hi there," Elena said softly. "That is a very brave rabbit you are holding. Does he have a name?" The child hiccuped, still crying, but the volume dropped. She looked at Elena with wide, wet eyes and clutched the rabbit tighter. "Grace doesn't talk to strangers," the boy at the door said flatly. "Nobody talks in this house. You should know that before you waste your time." Elena glanced up at him, but did not answer right away. She turned back to the little girl, whose name she now understood was Grace, and smiled gently. "That's okay. Rabbits can talk for her. What does he like to eat?" Grace blinked. Then, so quietly Elena almost missed it, she whispered, "Carrots." It was the first small victory in a house that felt like it had not seen a soft word in months. That was how Elena Hartley's life inside the Marchetti house began. Not with an introduction or a handshake, but with a screaming child on a staircase, and a boy who had already decided the world had nothing left to give him. 3 days earlier, Elena had been sitting in a small, sunlit classroom on the other side of the city, grading spelling tests and thinking about nothing more dangerous than whether she had enough coffee left for the morning. She was 28 years old, unmarried, and had spent the last 6 years teaching 2nd grade at a public school, where the walls were thin and the paint was peeling, but the children loved her fiercely. She was not the kind of woman anyone described as glamorous. She wore her light brown hair pulled back in a simple braid, favored cardigans over anything fashionable, and had a habit of humming old lullabies under her breath when she graded papers. She was, by every measure that mattered to her, happy. Then the phone call came. It was from a woman named Colette, who introduced herself as a household manager working for a private family. Colette explained, in careful and measured words, that the family needed someone experienced with children, someone patient, someone who could start immediately. The pay offered was nearly 4 times what Elena made as a teacher. Elena almost said no. She had a job she loved, a small apartment she was fond of, a life that made sense. But something in Colette's voice, a kind of quiet desperation dressed up as professionalism, made Elena pause. "The children have been through a great deal," Colette had said. "Their mother passed 6 months ago. The staff we've hired have not lasted more than a week. We need someone who won't give up on the first hard day." Elena thought of her classroom, of the children there who had parents to come home to, siblings to fight with, dinners waiting on the table. She thought of children somewhere in this city who had none of that anymore. She said yes before she had fully decided to say it. She was not told, not at first, whose children they were. She learned that only when the car sent to collect her turned down a private road lined with tall iron gates and armed men in dark coats who nodded the driver through without a word. She learned it when she saw the name carved into the stone archway above the entrance. Marchetti. Everyone in the city knew that name, even a school teacher who kept mostly to herself. Dominic Marchetti was not a name spoken loosely in cafes or on street corners. He was spoken of the way people speak of storms, with respect and distance, always careful not to draw his attention. Elena's stomach had tightened when she read the name, and for a moment, she considered asking the driver to turn the car around. But then she thought of the children again, somewhere behind those gates, growing up motherless, in a house full of silence and fear. She stayed in the car. Now, kneeling on a marble staircase with a crying toddler and carrots as her only weapon, Elena understood exactly what kind of house she had walked into. Over the following hour, she learned the shape of the household. The boy at the door was Lucas, 14 years old, sharp-tongued and guarded, the kind of teenager who had learned that showing weakness in this house was not safe. The middle child was a girl named Mia, 11 years old, who Elena had not yet seen, but who Colette described as quiet, too quiet, she barely speaks anymore. And little Grace, not yet 3, who had been the one crying on the stairs, too young to understand why her mother had stopped coming to say goodnight. Colette led Elena through the house, a place that felt more like a museum than a home. Every surface gleamed. Every room was perfectly arranged, and yet nothing in it felt lived in, felt warm, felt like children actually played there. There were no crayon marks on the walls, no toys scattered across the floor, no half-finished puzzles on a table. It was as if the house itself had been told to hold its breath. "Mr. Marchetti will want to meet you before you begin properly," Colette said, her voice dropping slightly as they approached a set of dark wooden doors at the end of a long hallway. "He is a private man. Answer his questions honestly. Do not embellish. He does not like flattery, and he can tell when someone is performing for him." Elena's palms were damp as Colette knocked twice and opened the door. The study was dim, lit only by a single lamp on a heavy desk and the pale afternoon light filtering through tall windows. Dominic Marchetti stood with his back to the door, looking out over the grounds, his hands clasped behind him. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark suit that fit him the way armor fits a soldier, more purpose than fashion. When he turned to face her, Elena had to resist the urge to step back. His eyes were the first thing she noticed, dark and sharp, the eyes of a man who had spent years reading people before they had a chance to lie to him. His face was handsome in a severe way, all hard lines and little softness, except for the faint shadows beneath his eyes that spoke of nights without much sleep. He studied her the way one might study a stranger who had wandered onto private property, not unkindly, but without any warmth either. "You're the new one," he said. His voice was low, controlled, the voice of a man used to being obeyed without needing to raise it. "The 4th this year." "Elena Hartley," she said, keeping her voice steady even though her heart was pounding. "I know your name. I read the file." He walked slowly around the desk, not toward her, just pacing, the way a man paces when he is deciding something important. "What I don't know is why you'll last any longer than the others." Elena had thought, on the ride over, about what she might say if this moment came. She had imagined polished answers, professional answers, the kind of thing you say in an interview to sound impressive. But standing in that dim study, in front of a man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered, all of that polish fell away, and what was left was simply the truth. "I won't pretend I'm not afraid," she said. "Everyone in this city knows your name, and not because of anything gentle. I know what people say about you. I know the kind of world your children are growing up in, and I know I have no place in it. I'm not beautiful in the way I imagine the women who usually stand in this room are beautiful. I don't come from money. I don't know how to navigate rooms like this one, and I'm sure I'll say the wrong thing more than once." She paused, watching his face for some reaction, but he gave none, only continued to study her with that same unreadable expression. "But I have spent 6 years with children nobody else wanted to sit with," she continued. "The ones who acted out because no one had taught them another way to ask for help. The ones who stopped talking because talking had only ever gotten them hurt. I don't know how to run your household, Mr. Marchetti. I don't know your world, and honestly, I don't want to. But I know children. I know what it looks like when a child is drowning quietly, the way your daughter was drowning on those stairs 20 minutes ago. I may not be the woman you'd pick to walk into this house, but I can love your children. That much I know how to do." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Elena began to regret every word. Dominic's expression did not soften, not exactly, but something in his eyes shifted, some calculation being made behind them that she could not read. "My wife has been gone 6 months, he said finally, his voice quieter now. "In that time, my son has stopped bringing home anything but silence. My middle daughter has not said a full sentence to me in weeks. And Grace cries for a woman who is never coming back, and none of the people I have paid a great deal of money to fix this have managed to do anything but make it worse." He looked at her directly now, and for the first time she saw something almost human beneath the hardness, something that looked dangerously close to exhaustion. I don't need someone who is polished, Miss Hartley. I have polished people. They smile at me and lie to my face and leave the moment things become difficult. What I need is someone who will not run the first time something in this house frightens her. I don't frighten easily, Elena said, though her hands were still trembling slightly at her sides. We'll see, Dominic said. It was not a warm answer, but it was not a dismissal either. You may begin today. Colette will show you where you'll be staying. My children's safety is not negotiable, Miss Hartley. There are rules in this house. Rules you will follow without question, for reasons I will not explain to you. Do you understand? I understand. He studied her a moment longer, as if searching for a crack in her resolve, some sign that her words had been performance after all. Whatever he was looking for, he did not seem to find it, because he finally gave a short nod and turned back toward the window, a clear signal that the conversation had ended. Elena left the study with her pulse still racing, but underneath the fear was something else, something steadier. She had meant every word she said. She did not know yet what it would cost her to keep that promise. Over the following hours, Elena met the rest of the children properly. Mia, the middle child, was found curled in a window seat in the library, a book open on her lap that she was not actually reading. She had her mother's same light eyes, Colette mentioned quietly, and it seemed to be the reason the household staff found it hardest to look directly at her. Elena did not push. She simply sat on the floor near the window seat, far enough away to not crowd the girl, and began reading her own book aloud, quietly, as though to no one in particular. She did not ask Mia to respond. She did not ask her to smile. She simply existed nearby, patient and calm, the way one might sit near a frightened animal without reaching for it. After 20 minutes, Mia spoke for the first time that day. That's the wrong voice for the villain, she said. He's supposed to sound bored, not angry. Elena looked up, careful not to show too much excitement at the small victory. Would you like to show me how it's done? Mia hesitated, chewing on the corner of her sleeve, and then, so softly Elena almost missed it again, she began to read. By evening, Elena had learned the rhythm of the house, at least the surface of it. Meals were eaten in near silence, the children seated at opposite ends of an enormous table that seemed designed to keep them apart rather than together. The staff moved through the halls like ghosts, careful, quiet, trained not to be noticed. Dominic did not appear at dinner, and Elena learned from Colette that this was not unusual. He eats later, Colette explained, after his meetings. Sometimes he doesn't eat at all. Elena thought of the man in the study, the sharpness in his eyes, the exhaustion beneath it, and felt an unexpected pull of sympathy she had not been prepared for. She reminded herself, firmly, that she was here for the children. Whatever weight Dominic Marchetti carried in his world outside this house was not her concern. But that night, long after the children had been put to bed, after Grace had finally stopped crying with Elena humming an old lullaby beside her crib, after Lucas had grunted something close to a good night through his bedroom door, and after Mia had asked, in a whisper, if Elena would read again tomorrow, Elena found herself standing at the tall window at the end of the hallway, looking down at the courtyard below. Dominic stood there alone, his jacket removed, his sleeves rolled up, speaking in low tones to a man Elena did not recognize. Even from a distance, she could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful control in every movement. A man holding something together by sheer will. The other man said something, and Dominic's expression darkened in a way that made Elena's stomach tighten with an instinct she could not name. Then, as if sensing he was being watched, Dominic looked up toward the window. Their eyes met across the courtyard, across the distance between two entirely different worlds. Elena did not look away, and neither did he. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then he turned back to the man beside him, and Elena stepped back from the window, her heart beating strangely fast, though she told herself it was only the cold night air, and nothing more. She had come into this house to save 3 children from the quiet, grinding grief of losing their mother. She had not expected the man at the center of it all to be someone whose eyes carried the same kind of grief, buried far deeper, guarded far more fiercely, but no less real. Elena Hartley climbed into the narrow bed in the small room she had been given, and for the first time in a long while, she found she could not stop thinking about the storm she had just walked into, and the strange, unexpected pull she already felt toward its center. Outside, in the dark courtyard, Dominic Marchetti stood alone, long after the other man had gone, staring up at the now empty window, wondering, against every instinct that had kept him alive this long, whether he had just made a terrible mistake in letting this woman into his home, or the first right decision he had made in 6 long months. The plate shattered against the kitchen floor before Elena could catch it, and for one terrible second, the entire room went silent. Lucas stood by the counter, his chest heaving, his hands still shaking from having thrown it. Grace, seated in her high chair nearby, began to wail. Mia dropped her spoon and stared at her brother with wide, frightened eyes. It was the 3rd week of Elena's time in the house, and it was the first time she had seen Lucas truly lose control. "You don't get to tell me what she would have wanted," Lucas said, his voice cracking somewhere between anger and grief. "You didn't even know her." Elena crouched down slowly and began picking up the broken pieces, careful not to look directly at him, giving him space to breathe. "You're right," she said calmly. "I never met your mother. I only know what your father and Colette have told me, and what I can see in the 3 of you. But I know that whatever I said just now upset you, and I'm sorry for that. Can you tell me what I got wrong?" Lucas's jaw tightened. For a moment, it seemed he would storm out of the room the way he usually did when things became too heavy. Instead, he sank into a chair at the table, his anger deflating into something closer to exhaustion. "She used to make pancakes shaped like animals every Sunday," he said quietly. "You said we should have pancakes this morning like it was some kind of treat. It's not a treat. It's the only thing that made this house feel normal, and now it just feels like something else that's gone." Elena set the broken pieces aside and sat across from him, giving Grace's chair a gentle rock with one hand to soothe her cries. "Then we won't have pancakes unless you want them," she said. "I didn't know that story, Lucas, and I'm glad you told me. I don't want to replace anything that was hers. I only want to help make new mornings that don't feel so empty. But that has to include the things that were good, not erase them." Lucas didn't answer, but he didn't leave the table either, and by the time breakfast ended, he had quietly helped Mia cut her toast into shapes, the way, Elena would later learn, their mother used to do. Small moments like this became the rhythm of Elena's days in the Marchetti house. There were no dramatic breakthroughs, no single afternoon where the children suddenly became whole again. Instead, there was a slow, careful accumulation of trust, built one honest conversation at a time. Grace began sleeping through the night within the 2nd week, no longer waking at 2 in the morning, calling for a mother who could not answer. Mia started speaking more freely, first only to Elena, then, tentatively, to the rest of the household staff. Even Lucas, guarded as he was, began leaving his bedroom door open in the evenings, a small but unmistakable invitation, Dominic noticed. Elena could feel him noticing, even though he rarely said anything directly. He would appear at the edges of rooms sometimes, standing in doorways with his arms crossed, watching his children laugh at something Elena had said, his expression unreadable, but no longer as distant as it had been that first day in his study. He did not offer compliments easily, but one evening, as Elena passed him in the hallway carrying a stack of folded laundry that belonged to Grace, he stopped her with a quiet word. "Mia asked me today what my favorite color was," he said, as though the statement required no context. "She hasn't asked me anything in months." Elena adjusted the laundry in her arms, unsure how to respond to something that felt, in its own quiet way, like gratitude. "What did you tell her?" "Green," he said. Her mother's eyes were green. He looked at Elena for a long moment, something flickering behind his guarded expression, and then he continued down the hallway without another word, leaving Elena standing there with an unfamiliar warmth spreading through her chest that she quickly tried to talk herself out of feeling. She reminded herself, often and firmly, why she was there. She was there for Grace's sleepless nights, for Mia's silence, for Lucas's anger. She was not there to notice the way Dominic's shoulders relaxed slightly when his children laughed, or the way his voice softened, almost imperceptibly, whenever he spoke about their mother. She was not there to wonder what kind of man he might have been in another life, one without gates and guarded men, and a name that made people lower their eyes in the street. But the house, for all its silence, was not free of danger, and Elena began to understand this more clearly with each passing week. She noticed it first in small things, the way certain rooms in the house were always kept locked, and the way the staff avoided walking past them entirely. The way two men she did not recognize sat outside the front gates in a black car nearly every night, watching the road rather than the house. The way Dominic sometimes left in the middle of the night, and Colette would appear the next morning looking as though she had not slept, offering no explanation beyond a tight, practiced smile. One afternoon, while walking the children back from the private garden at the rear of the property, Elena noticed a man standing just beyond the tree line at the edge of the grounds, watching the house with a stillness that made her skin prickle. He was too far away for her to see his face clearly, but something about the way he stood, patient and unmoving, unsettled her deeply. She quickened the children's pace back toward the house, without explaining why, and by the time she glanced back, the man was gone. She mentioned it to Colette that evening, expecting perhaps a dismissive answer, a reassurance that it was nothing. Instead, Colette's face went pale, and she left the room without a word, returning 10 minutes later to inform Elena that Mr. Marchetti wished to see her immediately. Dominic's study felt different this time when Elena entered, tenser, the air itself seeming to hold its breath. He was standing behind his desk, and beside him stood a man Elena had seen once or twice in passing, tall and severe, introduced to her weeks ago simply as Nathaniel, a name spoken with a kind of quiet deference by everyone in the household. "Describe him," Dominic said without preamble. "The man you saw, every detail you remember." Elena did her best, describing the man's height, the dark coat he wore despite the mild weather, the way he had stood so still, it had unsettled her more than any sudden movement might have. Nathaniel exchanged a look with Dominic that Elena could not interpret, though the tightness in Dominic's jaw told her it was not good news. "You did well to bring the children inside quickly," Dominic said, his voice carefully controlled, though Elena could sense the effort it took to keep it that way. "From now on, the children are not to go into the garden alone, and you are not to take them beyond the eastern wall without Nathaniel or myself present. Do you understand?" "Is something wrong?" Elena asked, though some part of her already suspected the answer. Dominic hesitated, and for a moment, Elena thought he might simply dismiss her question the way he had dismissed so many others in the past weeks, retreating behind the careful walls he kept around every part of his life that did not directly involve his children. Instead, he walked around the desk and stood closer to her than he ever had before, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear it. "There are people in my world who see my children, not as children, but as leverage," he said. "People who believe that hurting what I love is the fastest way to control what I have built. I have kept them safe for 6 months by making certain no one doubts what will happen to anyone who tries. But lately, there have been signs that someone is testing those boundaries again." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face in a way that felt almost like an apology. "I did not want to burden you with this. It is not the life I would choose for them, and it is certainly not the life I imagine you signed on for when Colette called you 3 weeks ago." Elena felt fear coil tightly in her stomach, but beneath it, something steadier held firm, the same resolve that had carried her up that staircase on her very first day. "I'm not leaving," she said. "If anything, this only means the children need consistency more than ever. They've lost enough. I won't be one more person who disappears on them because things became difficult." Something shifted in Dominic's expression then, something Elena would spend the following days trying to name. It was not quite relief, and it was not quite gratitude, but it sat somewhere close to both, mixed with a wariness that seemed to war constantly within him, the instinct of a man who had learned, painfully, not to trust easily. "You should know," he said quietly, "that most people in my position never explain themselves to anyone. Not to staff, not to associates, and certainly not to the person hired to look after my children." He paused again, as though weighing whether to continue. "I am not telling you this because I owe you an explanation. I am telling you because I find, against my better judgment, that I want you to understand." Elena did not know how to answer that, so she said nothing, and the silence between them stretched, charged with something neither of them was ready to acknowledge aloud. In the days that followed, the household tightened its precautions. More men appeared at the gates. Nathaniel became a near constant presence whenever the children left the main house. Dominic's absences grew longer, his expression grimmer each time he returned, though he never failed to check on the children before retreating to his study, often standing silently in their doorways, long after they had fallen asleep, watching them breathe as though reassuring himself they were still safe. Elena found herself watching him too, in these quiet moments, seeing beneath the armor he wore for the rest of the world, a man exhausted by the weight of protecting everything he loved, in a world that offered him no safe place to set that weight down. She told herself, again and again, that her growing understanding of him was simply part of doing her job well, that a caregiver needed to understand the family she served in order to serve them properly. But late one evening, when she found him standing alone in the nursery after Grace had finally drifted off to sleep, his large hand resting gently on the edge of the crib, his eyes distant with some memory Elena could not see, she felt something in her chest tighten that had nothing to do with professional understanding at all. "She used to stand right here," Dominic said quietly, not turning around, seemingly aware of Elena's presence without needing to look. "Every night, even after a hard day, even after everything that happened outside these walls, she would stand here and just watch them sleep. I used to think it was the only peace either of us ever really had." Elena stepped further into the room, standing beside him, close enough to see the tightness around his eyes, the grief he so rarely allowed himself to show. "You still have that peace," she said softly. "It's still here. It just looks different now." Dominic turned to look at her then, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between them, the distance of two entirely different worlds colliding in the quiet of a sleeping child's room, seemed to shrink without either of them moving an inch. "Thank you," he said finally, his voice rough with something unspoken, "for not running." "I told you," Elena said, holding his gaze steadily, despite the way her heart pounded against her ribs. "I don't frighten easily." He almost smiled then, the first real hint of one Elena had seen since arriving in this house, and though it vanished as quickly as it appeared, it stayed with her long after she had returned to her own room that night, a small, fragile crack in the walls of a man the rest of the world believed to be unbreakable. Neither of them spoke of the man in the tree line again that week, though Elena noticed the guards had doubled at every entrance, and Nathaniel now slept in a room near the children's wing, rather than the staff quarters across the estate. She understood, without needing to be told, that whatever storm was gathering beyond the gates of this house had not passed. It had only begun to circle closer, and everyone within these walls, staff and family alike, would soon have to face whatever it was bringing with it. Mia's laughter rang through the kitchen, bright and unguarded, as she and Grace stacked cookie dough into uneven, lopsided shapes, while Elena tried, without much success, to keep flour off the countertops. Lucas leaned against the doorway, pretending not to be interested, though the small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth gave him away. It was an ordinary afternoon, the kind Elena had once believed impossible in this house, and it was precisely because it felt so ordinary that she almost missed the sound of the front door opening earlier than expected. Dominic rarely returned home before evening, and even then, he usually entered through the side corridor that led directly to his study, avoiding the busier parts of the house until he had shed whatever weight the outside world had placed on his shoulders that day. But today he walked straight into the kitchen, still in his dark coat, his expression softer than Elena had seen it in weeks. "Something smells like it's burning," he said, though his eyes were on the chaos of flour and dough rather than any real concern. "That would be Grace's contribution," Elena said, gesturing to a tray of oddly shaped cookies that Grace had insisted on decorating entirely with chocolate chips. "She has strong opinions about proportion." Dominic's mouth curved into something that was, unmistakably, a real smile, and Elena felt her own breath catch slightly at the sight of it. It transformed his face entirely, softened the hard lines that seemed permanently etched there, made him look, for just a moment, like a man who had never carried the weight of a world built on fear and careful violence. "Papa, try one," Mia said, thrusting a lopsided cookie toward him before he could protest. He took it, examined it with mock seriousness, and then ate it in one bite, nodding solemnly, as though passing judgment on a fine meal, rather than a slightly burnt cookie made by a 9-year-old. "Best I've had all year," he declared, and Mia beamed with a pride that made Elena's chest ache with quiet happiness. It became, in the weeks that followed, a pattern that no one in the household commented on directly, but that everyone noticed. Dominic began coming home earlier. He began appearing at dinner more often, seated now not at the head of a long, isolating table, but pulled closer, so the family could actually speak to one another, without shouting across the distance. He asked Lucas about school, really asked, and listened to the answers instead of simply nodding along. He sat with Mia in the library some evenings, not saying much, simply present while she read, occasionally glancing at Elena across the room with an expression she was slowly learning to recognize as gratitude, mixed with something warmer, something neither of them had yet found the courage to name. Elena told herself, repeatedly, that these changes were good for the children and nothing more. She told herself this the night Dominic found her in the kitchen, long after the household had gone to sleep, the two of them sharing a pot of tea in comfortable silence, talking not about the children or the household or the dangers lurking beyond the gates, but about small, ordinary things. Her years teaching, his memories of a childhood far different from the one his own children now lived, the books they had both loved as children. She told herself this again the following week, when he began seeking her out simply to talk, finding excuses, thin and increasingly transparent, to be in whatever room she occupied. But there was no denying it any longer, not really. Not when she found herself watching for the sound of his car in the driveway each evening, not when she felt a warmth spread through her chest, every time he looked at her the way he had begun to look at her lately, as though she were the first steady thing he had found, in a life built on constant vigilance and calculated distance. Colette noticed too, and one afternoon, while helping Elena fold laundry in the small room adjoining the nursery, she spoke carefully, choosing her words with the caution of someone who had worked in this house long enough to understand its dangers intimately. "He hasn't smiled like this since before his wife passed," Colette said, not quite meeting Elena's eyes. "I want you to understand that I say this with nothing but goodwill. But you should be careful, Miss Hartley. Men like Mr. Marchetti do not simply fall in love the way other men do. When they do, it becomes another target, painted on everything they hold dear. Everyone who gets close to him becomes a piece on a board that other men are always looking for a way to remove." Elena folded a small shirt of Grace's carefully, considering the warning. "I'm not trying to become anything to him," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain she believed them anymore. "I'm here for the children." Colette gave her a small, sad smile. "I believe that's true. I also believe it stopped being the whole truth some weeks ago." She hesitated, then added, more gently, "I only wish for both of you what happiness can be found in a life like this one. But happiness in this house has always come with a price, Miss Hartley. I would hate to see you learn that the hard way." Elena thought about those words often in the days that followed, turning them over carefully, even as she continued to watch Dominic's guarded exterior soften a little more each day, even as she found herself, against every warning her own instincts offered her, drawn further into the quiet gravity of his presence. The turning point came on an evening when a sudden summer storm knocked out power across the estate, plunging the house into darkness, lit only by scattered candles Colette hurried to distribute. Grace, frightened by the sudden dark and the low rumble of thunder outside, refused to settle, clinging to Elena with small fists gripping her cardigan. Elena carried her through the darkened hallways, humming softly, searching for calm in a house that suddenly felt unfamiliar without its usual electric glow. She found Dominic in the sitting room, a single candle flickering on the table beside him, staring into the dark fireplace with an expression of quiet contemplation. He looked up when she entered, and something in his face shifted immediately upon seeing Grace's frightened, tear-streaked cheeks. "Come here, little one," he said gently, holding out his arms, and Elena watched with a swell of emotion she could not entirely contain, as Grace, without hesitation, reached for her father and settled against his chest, her small fists curling into the fabric of his shirt, as her cries slowly quieted into soft, hiccuping breaths. Elena sat on the couch across from them, watching the storm outside flash brief silver light across the room, watching Dominic hum, awkwardly at first, and then with growing confidence, the same lullaby Elena often used to settle Grace at night. It was a small, unremarkable moment in the grand scale of things, a father comforting his daughter during a storm, but it struck Elena with unexpected force. The sight of this powerful, guarded man reduced to something so simply, achingly human. "You're good at that," she said softly, once Grace had fully drifted off against his shoulder. "I wasn't. For a long time," Dominic admitted quietly, his eyes fixed on his sleeping daughter rather than on Elena. "After my wife died, I didn't know how to be in a room with them without feeling like I was failing them somehow. I kept myself busy with everything except them, because it was easier than facing how badly I was failing at the one thing that mattered most." He looked up then, meeting Elena's eyes across the candlelit room. "You changed that. I don't know how to properly explain what you've done for this family, Elena, but I know I haven't felt this much like myself, like the man I want to be for them, in a very long time." The candlelight flickered between them, and Elena felt the weight of his words settle over her, warm and terrifying all at once. "I only gave them a little patience," she said softly. "The rest, they found on their own. You found on your own." "That's not entirely true," Dominic said, his voice low, careful, as though testing the ground before stepping fully onto it. "You gave them something I couldn't, and somewhere along the way, without meaning to, I think you gave something back to me as well." Elena's heart pounded against her ribs, loud enough she was certain he must be able to hear it in the quiet room. She knew, with sudden and startling clarity, that whatever careful distance she had tried to maintain between herself and this family, between herself and this man, had long since collapsed entirely, and there was no pretending otherwise any longer, not to Colette, not to herself, and certainly not to the man sitting across from her, his sleeping daughter cradled gently against his chest, his eyes holding hers with a warmth that had nothing guarded left in it at all. Neither of them said anything further that night. The storm eventually passed, the power flickered back on, and Elena carried Grace up to bed while Dominic returned, reluctantly, to whatever work still awaited him in his study. But something had shifted irreversibly between them, an understanding neither had spoken aloud, but both now carried, quietly, into the days that followed. It was only a week later that the fragile peace they had built together began to show its first true cracks. Nathaniel arrived at the house one afternoon with a expression Elena had never seen on him before, something close to alarm beneath his usual composed exterior. He asked to see Dominic immediately, and the two men disappeared into the study for nearly an hour, their voices, though muffled by the heavy door, carrying an unmistakable tension that Elena felt settle over the entire household like a held breath. When Dominic finally emerged, his face had returned to the hardened, guarded expression Elena had not seen since her earliest days in the house, the mask he wore for a world that showed no mercy to those who let their guard down. He found her in the garden, watching the children play in the fading afternoon light, and the look he gave her carried a warning she felt in her bones before he even spoke a single word. "We need to talk," he said quietly, "somewhere private." Elena felt the warmth of the previous weeks drain away, replaced by the cold, familiar grip of fear. The same fear she had felt her very first day walking through the gates of this house. Whatever peace they had built together, she understood now, was about to be tested in a way neither of them was fully prepared for. The study door had barely closed behind them when Dominic spoke, his voice tight with a controlled urgency that frightened Elena more than shouting ever could have. "The man you saw at the tree line weeks ago has been identified," he said, pacing behind his desk rather than sitting, his hands flexing at his sides as though searching for something to hold on to. "He works for Victor Caldwell, a man who has wanted what belongs to me for a very long time. Nathaniel believes Caldwell has grown tired of waiting for an opportunity and has decided to create one instead." Elena's stomach twisted. "What does that mean? What kind of opportunity?" Dominic stopped pacing and looked at her directly, and for the first time since she had known him, she saw something in his eyes that looked unmistakably like fear, though it took her a moment to understand it was not fear for himself. "It means he intends to use my children against me, and now, it seems, he has taken an interest in you as well. You've been seen with them enough, in enough public places, that Caldwell's people believe you matter to me, and they are not wrong." The admission hung in the air between them, heavier than anything either of them had said aloud before, but there was no time to dwell on it. not with the weight of what he was telling her pressing down on the room. "What do we do?" Elena asked, forcing her voice to stay steady even as her pulse raced. "You do nothing," Dominic said firmly. "You stay inside these walls, with Nathaniel and the additional guards I am bringing in tonight. The children do not leave the estate under any circumstance until this is resolved. I will handle Caldwell the way these things have always been handled in my world." Elena felt a flare of frustration cut through her fear. "And what does that mean exactly? You disappear into meetings I'm not allowed to ask about, and I'm supposed to sit here and pretend everything is fine for the children, while not knowing if you'll come home at all?" Dominic's jaw tightened, and for a moment, Elena thought he might simply shut the conversation down the way he once would have, retreating behind the same walls he had spent weeks slowly lowering. Instead, he crossed the room and stood close to her, closer than he had ever stood before, his eyes searching hers with an intensity that stole the breath from her lungs. "I have spent my entire life protecting the people who depend on me, by keeping them at a careful distance from exactly this kind of danger," he said, his voice low and rough. "I told myself, when you first walked into this house, that I would keep you at that same distance too. It would have been the responsible thing to do, but I failed at that within the first month, Elena, because you did not act like someone who could be kept at a distance. You walked straight into the middle of everything broken in this family and refused to leave, and now, because of that, you are not just my children's caregiver. You are someone I would burn this entire city down to keep safe, and that terrifies me more than Victor Caldwell ever could." Elena's breath caught, and for a long moment, neither of them moved, the weight of his words settling over the room like something physical. She had known, on some level, that her feelings for this man had grown far beyond anything professional weeks ago. Hearing him say it aloud, admitting the same truth from behind all his careful guarding, made it impossible to pretend any longer. "Then let me help," she said quietly, "not with whatever dangerous things you handle outside these walls, but let me help keep the children steady through this. Let me be someone you don't have to protect from the truth of what's happening, because I would rather face this with clear eyes beside you than be kept safely in the dark while you carry it alone." Something in Dominic's expression cracked further, the last remnants of the careful distance he had tried, and failed, to maintain finally giving way entirely. He reached up, his hand cradling her face with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything the world believed about him, his thumb brushing lightly across her cheek. "I don't deserve someone who says things like that to me," he murmured. "That's not for you to decide," Elena said softly, leaning slightly into his touch despite every instinct warning her how complicated this had all become. "That's my choice to make." The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged, until the sound of raised voices from somewhere downstairs shattered it entirely. Dominic pulled back immediately, his expression hardening back into the guarded mask of the man the rest of the world knew, and within seconds, he was moving toward the door, Elena close behind him, both of them abandoning whatever tender moment had just passed between them in favor of whatever new crisis awaited downstairs. They found Nathaniel in the front hall, speaking urgently into a phone, his face pale in a way Elena had never seen before. When he saw Dominic, he ended the call immediately. "They found one of Caldwell's men near the eastern wall," Nathaniel said, his voice tight. "Our people caught him trying to get past the perimeter fence. He didn't get far, but it confirms what we suspected. Caldwell isn't testing us anymore. He's preparing to make a move, and soon." Dominic's expression went cold and still, the transformation from the man who had just gently touched Elena's face to the man capable of commanding fear across an entire city happening in the space of a single breath. "Get the children into the safe room upstairs," he said to Elena, his voice clipped and authoritative in a way she had not heard him use with her before. "Now, Elena, please." She did not argue. She moved quickly through the house, gathering Lucas, Mia, and Grace, keeping her voice calm and light even as her heart pounded with fear, framing it to the children as an adventure, a special game where they got to spend the evening in the cozy room behind the library with extra blankets and their favorite books. Lucas, old enough to sense the truth beneath her carefully cheerful tone, caught her eye once, his expression far too knowing for a boy his age, but he said nothing in front of his younger sisters, simply nodded and helped guide Mia along without complaint. Once the children were settled, Their initial anxiety soothed with stories and quiet reassurances, Elena finally allowed herself a moment to sit against the wall of the small, reinforced room and let out a shaking breath. Through the thick door, she could hear the muffled sounds of activity throughout the house, footsteps hurrying, voices low and urgent, the unmistakable atmosphere of a household bracing itself for something it had hoped never to face again. Hours passed in that room, the children eventually falling asleep curled together on the cushions Colette had brought in earlier, while Elena remained awake, listening to every sound beyond the door, her mind replaying Dominic's words in the study over and over, unable to shake the fear that she might not see him again, once whatever was unfolding outside these walls reached its conclusion. It was well past midnight when the door finally opened, and Dominic stepped inside, his jacket gone, his shirt sleeves rolled, a tension in his shoulders that told Elena the night's events, whatever they had been, were far from over. He looked exhausted, but relief flickered across his face when his eyes found her, still awake, still watching over his sleeping children, exactly as she had promised she would. "It's contained for tonight," he said quietly, careful not to wake the children as he moved further into the room. "Caldwell's man has been dealt with, but this isn't over, Elena. Caldwell will try again, likely sooner than any of us would like. I need you to understand what you've chosen to stay in the middle of." Elena rose to her feet, closing the distance between them despite the exhaustion weighing on both of them. "I understood that the moment I climbed those stairs on my first day here," she said softly. "I'm not leaving, Dominic. Not the children, and not you." He studied her for a long moment, in the dim light of the safe room, something fierce and grateful, and afraid, all warring behind his dark eyes, before he finally pulled her gently into his arms, holding her the way a man holds onto the one steady thing, in a world determined to take everything from him. Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, and understood, with a clarity that both frightened and calmed her, that whatever storm Victor Caldwell was preparing to unleash upon this family, she would face it standing exactly where she now stood, beside Dominic Marchetti, and the children who had, somewhere in these past weeks, become as much her own as if she had raised them from the very beginning. Neither of them spoke of what might come next that night. There would be time for planning, for strategy, for the careful, dangerous work of protecting everything they had built together. For now, in the quiet safety of a small reinforced room, with 3 sleeping children nearby, and the sound of each other's heartbeat close enough to hear, they allowed themselves simply to hold on, bracing together for whatever the coming days would bring. The following days passed under a heavy, watchful tension that settled over the entire estate, like a fog that refused to lift. Extra guards patrolled the grounds at all hours. The children were not permitted outside the main house at all, and even indoors, their movements were carefully tracked, escorted from room to room by either Elena, Nathaniel, or one of the trusted household staff. Lucas, sensing more than the younger girls did, grew quiet and watchful, often standing near windows with an expression far too serious for a boy of 14. Mia clung more tightly to Elena during the day and struggled with nightmares at night, and Grace, sensitive to the shifted energy of the household even if she could not understand its cause, became clingy and easily startled by loud noises. Elena did her best to hold the household's emotional center steady, filling their days with enough structure and gentle distraction that the fear pressing in from beyond the gates did not fully seep into the children's daily lives. She read extra stories, invented games that kept them occupied indoors, and made certain that whatever tension she carried herself remained hidden behind a calm, reassuring presence whenever the children were near. Dominic, meanwhile, seemed to exist in a state of near constant motion, disappearing for hours at a time into meetings with Nathaniel and other men Elena did not recognize, his expression growing more strained with each passing day. He returned to the house each evening later than the last, but he never failed, no matter how late the hour, to check on his children before finally allowing himself rest, and more often than not, he sought out Elena as well, if only for a few stolen minutes in the quiet of the kitchen or the hallway outside the nursery. It was during one of these late-night moments, nearly a week after the incident at the Eastern Wall, that Dominic finally shared the full weight of what he was facing. "Caldwell has grown careless in his impatience," he said, sitting across from Elena at the kitchen table, a cup of tea cooling untouched between his hands. Which means he is more dangerous now, not less. Nathaniel believes he intends to make his move within the week, likely during the charity gathering my late wife used to organize each year. It has continued in her memory, and everyone who matters in this city will be in attendance. Caldwell would have no better opportunity to create the kind of chaos that serves his purposes. Then don't go, Elena said immediately, though she already suspected, from the set of his jaw, what his answer would be. If I don't attend, it signals weakness, and weakness invites exactly the kind of escalation I've spent years working to prevent, Dominic said. But I have a plan, one that will require careful handling, and one that, I'm afraid, will require your help as well. Elena listened as he explained, his voice low and measured, laying out a plan that involved drawing Caldwell's attention into the open, where Nathaniel and his men could finally act against him decisively, rather than continuing to react defensively to whatever threat he chose to manufacture next. The plan required the appearance of normalcy, a family attending a public event exactly as they always had, giving no outward sign that anything at all was amiss. It required Elena to be present as well, close to the children, ready to move them to safety at the first sign of trouble, trusting Nathaniel's men, stationed carefully throughout the venue, to handle whatever else might unfold. I won't pretend this isn't dangerous, Dominic said, watching her carefully for her reaction. I would understand entirely if you wanted no part of it. No one would think less of you for staying behind with the children in a secured location instead. Elena thought of everything she had learned in the weeks since walking through those iron gates, of Lucas's grief slowly softening into trust, of Mia finding her voice again one quiet page at a time, of Grace's small fists curling contentedly into her father's shirt during a thunderstorm. She thought of the man sitting across from her now, exhausted and afraid, in a way he allowed almost no one else to see, carrying the weight of protecting everyone he loved, in a world that offered him no safe place to set that burden down. I told you once that I don't frighten easily, she said steadily. I meant it then, and I mean it now. Whatever this family faces, I intend to face it standing beside you, not hidden away somewhere safe while you carry it all alone. Dominic reached across the table and took her hand, his thumb tracing gently over her knuckles, his eyes holding hers with a depth of feeling neither of them had fully voiced aloud yet, though it hung between them now, unmistakable and undeniable. I don't know what I did to deserve finding someone like you in the middle of all this, he murmured. You didn't do anything, Elena said softly, turning her hand to lace her fingers through his. You just kept your children close enough that I could find my way to all of you. The night of the charity gathering arrived with a tension that seemed to hum beneath every polished surface of the grand ballroom where the event was held. Elena stood near the edge of the room in an unfamiliar dress, feeling entirely out of place among the glittering crowd of the city's wealthiest and most powerful, her eyes constantly tracking the children, who stood near Colette by the refreshment tables, dressed formally and clearly uneasy, despite their best efforts to appear otherwise. Dominic moved through the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, exchanging careful pleasantries, playing the role expected of him, with a composure that betrayed nothing of the danger he knew was likely circling somewhere within that very room. Elena watched him from across the space, her heart aching with a mixture of pride and fear, understanding now more fully than ever the impossible balance he walked every single day of his life. It happened quickly, the way these things often do. A disturbance near the main entrance, raised voices, and then, cutting through the elegant murmur of the crowd, the unmistakable sound of a struggle breaking out. Elena moved instantly, gathering the children close, following the emergency route Nathaniel had carefully mapped out for her days earlier, guiding Lucas, Mia, and Grace through a side corridor toward the secured vehicle, waiting exactly where it was supposed to be. Behind her, she could hear the commotion escalating, shouts, the scrape of overturned furniture, and beneath it all, Dominic's voice, sharp and commanding, cutting through the chaos with an authority that silenced much of the panic around him almost immediately. Elena did not look back, focused entirely on getting the children safely into the car, her hands trembling as she buckled Grace into her seat, while Lucas, pale but composed, kept a protective arm around Mia beside him. It felt like an eternity, though it was likely only minutes, before Nathaniel appeared at the car door, informing her tersely that Caldwell had been apprehended, that the threat, at least for tonight, had been fully contained, and that Dominic would join them shortly. Elena held the children close, whispering reassurances she was not entirely certain she believed herself, until finally, the car door opened once more, and Dominic climbed inside, his jacket torn slightly at the shoulder, a faint bruise already forming along his jaw, but otherwise unharmed. The relief that flooded through Elena upon seeing him whole and safe was so overwhelming it nearly stole the breath from her lungs. She did not care, in that moment, about propriety or restraint. She reached for him, and he pulled her close without hesitation, holding her tightly, as the car pulled away from the chaos of the ballroom. His children pressed close on either side of them, safe, together, finally free of the immediate danger that had shadowed their every step for the past week. "It's over," Dominic murmured against her hair, his voice rough with exhaustion and relief in equal measure. "Caldwell is finished. He won't threaten this family again." Elena did not ask for details of what exactly that meant, understanding intuitively that some parts of Dominic's world would always remain beyond her reach, matters he would carry and resolve in ways she did not need, or perhaps did not want, to fully understand. What mattered, in this moment, was simply that they were together, safe, whole, the children finally able to breathe freely, without the weight of fear pressing down upon them. Later that night, once the children had finally settled into an exhausted sleep, worn out from the events of the evening, Elena found Dominic standing once more in the doorway of the nursery, watching Grace sleep peacefully, the same quiet vigil she had witnessed him keep so many nights before. But something in his posture was different now, lighter somehow, as though a weight he had carried for months had finally, if not entirely disappeared, at least begun to ease. "I keep thinking about what you said to me that very first day," he said quietly, not turning from the doorway as Elena came to stand beside him. "That you weren't the woman anyone would expect to walk into a house like this. That you didn't come from my world, didn't know how to navigate the things that come with it." He finally turned to look at her, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had never seen before that night. "You were right about all of that, and somehow, it turned out to be exactly what this family needed, what I needed." Elena reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his, feeling the steady warmth of his grip answer her own. "I told you I could love your children," she said softly. "I didn't know, that first day, that I would end up loving their father just as much." Dominic's expression softened further, something achingly tender, replacing the last remnants of the day's danger and exhaustion. "Then perhaps," he said quietly, "it's time we stop pretending that isn't true, and start building whatever comes next, together." Outside, the night had grown calm and quiet. The danger that had shadowed the family for the past week finally lifted, at least for now. Inside the nursery, with 3 sleeping children safe nearby and the steady warmth of Dominic's hand in hers, Elena felt, for the first time since walking through those iron gates weeks ago, that she had truly found her place, not just in this house, but in the fragile, hard-won family she had helped rebuild from the quiet wreckage of grief and fear. Spring arrived at the estate with a warmth that seemed to seep into every corner of the house, and for the first time since Elena had walked through its gates, the place felt entirely, unmistakably alive. The garden, once carefully manicured but rarely used, now bore the scattered evidence of children at play, a forgotten jump rope draped over a hedge, chalk drawings fading slowly on the stone pathways, a small wooden swing Dominic had built himself over a series of quiet weekend afternoons, insisting, despite Nathaniel's mild protests about proper craftsmanship, on doing the work with his own hands. Grace, now old enough to speak in full, confident sentences, had taken to calling Elena by a name that had settled into the household so naturally that no one quite remembered when it had first happened. It was not planned, not announced with any particular ceremony. It simply emerged one morning at breakfast, when Grace, reaching for a plate of pancakes shaped like small, careful animals, looked up and said the word without hesitation or thought, the way children often arrive at truths long before the adults around them are ready to acknowledge them aloud. "Mama, can I have 2?" The kitchen went quiet for a moment. Elena's hands stilled over the pan, her heart catching somewhere in her throat. Across the table, Dominic's eyes met hers, warm and steady, offering no correction, no gentle redirection, simply an unspoken acknowledgement of something that had been true, in every way that mattered, for longer than either of them had allowed themselves to admit. "Of course you can," Elena said softly, her voice thick with an emotion she did not try to hide, and Grace beamed, entirely unaware of the significance of the word she had just spoken, already reaching eagerly for her plate. Lucas, older now, and taller than he had been that first difficult year, caught Elena's eye across the table with a small, knowing smile, one that carried none of the guarded anger she remembered from her earliest days in this house. He had grown into a young man who spoke openly about his mother's memory, without the sharp defensiveness that had once accompanied every mention of her, able now to hold both his grief and his growing happiness, without one crowding out the other. Mia, seated beside him, had become the household's quiet chatterbox, filling meals with observations about books she was reading, and questions about the world that no longer went unanswered by silence. The household staff had changed too, in subtle but meaningful ways. Colette, who had once warned Elena so carefully about the dangers of loving a man like Dominic Marchetti, now moved through the house with an ease that had not existed during those first tense months, occasionally allowing herself small, genuine smiles when she witnessed the family gathered together in the evenings. The heavy, watchful silence that had once defined every room in this house had given way to something warmer, something that finally, truly resembled a home rather than a fortress, built to withstand grief. Dominic himself had changed most of all, though the transformation had been gradual, built one steady day at a time, rather than arriving all at once. He still carried the weight of the world he had inherited, a world that Elena understood would never fully release its hold on him, not entirely. But he had begun, in the months since Caldwell's threat had finally been resolved, to quietly shift the balance of that world, delegating more of its daily operations to trusted associates, stepping back from the front lines of danger in ways he had never previously allowed himself to consider. He was still Dominic Marchetti, still a man whose name commanded respect and careful distance throughout the city, but he had begun building, alongside that identity, a life centered far more deliberately around the family gathered within these walls. "I've been thinking," he said one evening, as the two of them sat together on the back terrace, watching the last light of sunset stretch long shadows across the garden where the children played nearby, "about what kind of life I want them to remember when they're grown and looking back on these years." Elena leaned against his shoulder, watching Lucas patiently teach Mia and Grace some elaborate game, with rules that seemed to change with each round, their laughter carrying easily across the warm evening air. "What have you decided?" "I want them to remember a father who was present," Dominic said quietly. "Not just protecting them from a distance, the way I did for so long after their mother passed, but actually here, in the small moments that matter. Pancakes on Sunday mornings, games in the garden, a father who came home for dinner because he wanted to, not because duty required it." He turned to look at her, his expression open and unguarded in the way it had become so naturally around her over these past months. "I want them to remember you as part of that too, Elena, not as someone hired to hold this family together during its hardest year, but as someone who chose to stay, who chose all of us, long after the difficult part was over." Elena felt her breath catch, understanding the weight beneath his careful words, even before he continued, watching him reach into his jacket pocket with a hand that, for the first time since she had known him, trembled slightly. "I know I am not an easy man to build a life with," he said, opening a small box to reveal a ring, simple and elegant, nothing like the ostentatious displays Elena might have imagined belonging to a man of his position, but exactly, perfectly suited to the woman he had come to know so intimately over these past months. "I know that loving me means accepting a world that will never be entirely free of complication or danger, but I also know, with a certainty I have not felt about anything in a very long time, that I want to build the rest of my life with you beside me, and beside our children." Elena's eyes filled with tears, happy ones, as she looked at the ring, at the man holding it, at the life they had built together from the fragile, uncertain beginning of a screaming toddler on a staircase months ago. "Our children," she repeated softly, testing the words, feeling the truth of them settle warmly into her chest. "You've called them that before, but I don't think I ever let myself fully believe you meant it the way I hoped you did." I've meant it for longer than I probably should have admitted, Dominic said, his voice rough with emotion. You told me, that very first day, that you might not be the woman anyone would expect to walk into this house. You were right. You weren't what anyone would have predicted for a man like me. You were something far better than anything I could have imagined asking for. He took her hand gently in his. Marry me, Elena. Let's build whatever comes next, together, as the family we've already become. Yes, Elena said, laughing through her tears, the word arriving without hesitation, without the careful weighing of risks and dangers that had once governed every decision in this house. Yes, of course, yes. The children, alerted by some instinct that something significant had just occurred, abandoned their game and rushed toward the terrace, and upon seeing the ring now settled on Elena's hand, upon understanding, in the way children often understand things faster and more completely than the adults around them expect, erupted into an eager chorus of questions and delighted exclamations. Grace demanded to know if this meant Elena was now, officially and permanently, her mother. Mia wanted to know if she could help plan the wedding. Lucas, standing slightly apart with the composure of someone nearly grown, simply smiled, wide and unguarded, before stepping forward to hug Elena tightly, whispering a quiet thank you against her shoulder that carried more meaning than any elaborate speech could have offered. The wedding took place months later, in the very garden where Elena had first begun to rebuild this family, one patient, careful day at a time. It was a small gathering, intimate rather than extravagant, attended by those who had witnessed this family's journey, from its darkest days, into the warmth it now carried so fully. Colette stood near the front, dabbing carefully at her eyes throughout the ceremony. Nathaniel, ever composed, allowed himself a rare, genuine smile as he watched the family he had sworn to protect finally find its way to lasting happiness. Lucas stood beside his father, serving proudly as his best man, while Mia and Grace, dressed in matching pale dresses, scattered flower petals along the garden path, with far more enthusiasm than precision. As Elena walked toward Dominic beneath an archway of flowers, she thought back to that very first day, to the fear that had gripped her heart as she climbed the grand staircase toward a screaming, grieving toddler, to the guarded, exhausted man who had studied her so carefully in his dim study, searching for some sign of insincerity he ultimately never found. She thought of every small, hard-won victory since then, every quiet breakthrough, every moment of danger they had faced and survived together, every ordinary evening that had slowly, steadily built into something extraordinary. She had told him, that very first day, that she might not be the woman anyone expected him to choose, but that she could love his children fully and completely. Standing now before him, ready to become not just their mother in every way that truly mattered, but his wife as well, she understood that love, the real and lasting kind, had never required her to be anyone other than exactly who she already was. I love you, Dominic murmured as she reached him, taking her hands in his eyes bright with unguarded joy in front of the small gathering of witnesses to this hard-won happiness. All of you, exactly as you are. I love you too, Elena answered, her voice steady and certain, exactly as you've become. Behind them, the children watched with wide, happy eyes, the garden filled with warmth and laughter, and the unmistakable sound of a family, once fractured by grief and danger, now fully and completely whole. And as Dominic leaned down to seal their vows with a gentle kiss, Elena understood that the story that had begun with a stranger's desperate plea on a staircase had found its true ending not in some dramatic, sweeping gesture, but in the quiet, steady accumulation of small moments, patiently built, one gentle day at a time, into a lifetime of belonging neither of them had ever expected to find, yet both now knew, with complete certainty, they would never again willingly live without.